Well, good day, morning, evening, whatever time it is when you're watching this lecture. My name is Adam Tomlinson. I am the minister at Westwood Christian Church on the southwest side of Madison. And I'm really sorry that because of the snow, we were unable to be in person together for this lecture. I'm especially sorry for that because this topic, Genesis, 2 through 11, there's so much that happens here, and the things that happen here are so important to the story that God tells throughout all of Scripture, right? This is the beginning of that story, and so it shouldn't surprise us that lots of really important things happen here. And it's because of that that I told Greg and Lisa that I would love to record my lecture so that you can watch it whenever you are able at your home on your computer. So with all that said, I'm sorry that we weren't able to do that because I really do love being with you and I love being able to interact with you. I'm also sad, I'm going to tell you up front, because there are lots of opinions about Genesis chapters 1 through 11. And as a presenter, especially with these passages, it's so helpful when you're able to actually see people who are listening to you so that you can address questions that crop up soon instead of letting them linger or hang. And so let me say, first off, I have full trust in both Greg and Lisa, as well as the other, people who will present and speak in your class. So feel free to ask them questions. Please do. If something I say strikes you as off, if you say, I can't believe a minister said or thinks those things, I don't know. Maybe you feel that way. I don't know. But if you feel that way, talk to them. But also, feel free to reach out to me. Adam@westwoodchristian.com is my email address. I'm happy to answer questions or clarify things. Happy to do that to whatever degree is helpful. Now, before we begin on my actual lecture, I want you in a moment to pause the video and write something down. I want you at the top of your page, wherever you're taking notes, I want you to write in a sentence, maybe 3, but no more than that. I want you to write down why you think Genesis chapters 1 through 11 were written. What is it that God is doing in these chapters? So pause the video now and write that down. Okay, so now that you're back, I want you to keep that in mind because we're going to revisit what you wrote down later on in our time together. We would have. Instead, you're going to kind of reflect on your own and perhaps find a classmate or two that you can sit down and talk this out with. There is a reason that God gave us community, a topic that we will return to in a little bit. And I want you to find the value in community in talking some of these things out. So let's jump in. Now, I've already mentioned that there are people who have very strong opinions on chapters 1 through 11 of Genesis. My understanding is that Greg already talked to you a little bit about Genesis chapter 1 through the first couple verses of chapter 2. And you have already begun to hear some of the different opinions about what genre of literature is Genesis 1. Is it this? Is it that? That's for you all to decide for yourself, and we'll find out from God in the future what that is exactly. But I say that just to let you know that those problems with interpretation that you already began to experience last week, they don't go away with the rest of the Bible. In fact, they continue throughout the rest of the Bible forever. I'm sorry to tell you, the entire Bible, reading that is an interpretive process that you are on for the rest of your life, which is great news because it means you don't have to have it all understood now. But when it comes to the Genesis 1 through 11, there are lots of opinions and lots of people have very passionate opinions about these chapters. And so I want to make one thing very clear before we even talk anymore. And that is this. I am a minister. I am recording this lecture at my church, on church equipment, a church that I love leading, a church that I preach for, 47 times out of the year or something like that. I preach from the Bible. I respect the Bible. I trust the Bible. The Bible is how we know about God It is how God chooses to reveal God's self. So, hear me say, before I get anywhere else, I want you to remember that. You can come back to this point in the video and go, okay, no. He said he agrees. He believes in the Bible. So I want that known before we get anywhere else in our lecture, because I want you to know that I believe the story that God is telling in the Bible is an incredible story that everyone needs. Everybody needs this story. So what that means is, I believe that it is okay for us to interpret these passages differently. I have been asked to teach you the way that I understand these passages. I don't pretend to think I understand them fully. All I can do is tell you the way I understand them. All I can do is tell you the way that they have made sense to me. And all I can do is tell you why I think that matters for the story that God is telling us. So, all that said, if you have questions, reach out to somebody, talk it over, but we're going to go from there. Remember, I believe and I trust in the Bible, and I'll repeat that occasionally to remind you, because I remember being in seminary and hearing some of these things. I remember being in Bible college and talking about these passages, and there were moments where you go, wait a minute, what did he just say? What did she just say? What does that mean about my faith? It's not my goal to put you in any of those positions today, but we're going to get going. Now, the first thing that I want to do, the first thing I want to do is perhaps one of these moments that might make you go, wait, what? Here's what I mean. I want you to think about the word myth. M-Y-T-H. Myth. When I use that word, what comes to your mind? Now, if you're like me, the first word that comes to your mind are things like Pegasus and perhaps Nessie or Bigfoot or, the Greek Titans, Hercules, Paul Bunyan. These are the kinds of stories that come to my mind when I heard the word myth. But when I was in college, I began to hear, professors around the Bible, not just these stories we're going to talk about today, but all sorts of stories in the Bible. They would talk about the so-and-so or the something myth. For us today, it's going to talk about things like the creation myth and the flood myth. And there's a reason that we do that in the academic world. And I want you to know that ahead of time. I'm going to try not to do that, but I have to confess to you that occasionally I just slip up, and I want you to know what I mean when I do that, so that you don't think, wait, what's he saying about these things? Here's the thing. There's a quote in your notes from a New Testament book that we read in seminary, or that I read in seminary, that I think defines myth super well. Here's how that book defines the word myth. Scholars use the term myth to indicate a story that is so true that it determines the truth of other stories or events. It is a world-making story. In America, it would be proper to speak of the myths of democracy and freedom in the world today. While neither freedom nor democracy is perfectly achieved, our belief in their truth shapes how we understand our world and ourselves. A myth is true not because it corresponds to some previously existing reality, but because it shapes the reality of people who come under its power. Now, there's more to that quote that you're welcome to read on your paper, but here is why I want you to know that. First off, what is helpful when we talk about the genre of myth is that something can be true even if it fits the genre of myth. In fact, for like Bible scholars, those of us who are peoples of faith, we will talk about myths as true things. But what's helpful is that it allows us to talk about multiple stories at the same time. As an example, we will see today in my lecture that there are other creation stories, other creation myths of the people around the Israelites. There are other flood myths of the people around the Israelites. And what's helpful when we talk about the Israelite flood myth is that it helps us remember that this is a genre of literature. Now, again, that doesn't mean it's true. It is our belief that the Bible is true. And so when I use that word, I'm not trying to say that the flood is the same as Hercules, or that the flood is the same as the Trojan War, or that the creation story that we have in Genesis 1 and 2 and elsewhere, that story should be considered like the Thanksgiving meeting that we all kind of know, even though historically we know that's not true. Those are what we would call myths. But you'll notice, especially with that Thanksgiving one, that while we're pretty sure that story, that event didn't happen the way that we all know it, despite the fact that it didn't happen, there is something true in it, isn't there? The same could be said of Jesus' parables. These parables, they educate us in the myth of the kingdom. Again, myth does not mean it's not true. It means that it is so true that we can't describe it perfectly. So Jesus' parables, there's truth in them, even though we don't know of any single father whose son went off and worked among the pigs. We don't think that story's true in that we don't think it happened, but we do think it's true in that it teaches us something about God. Now, I say all that to say, I'm going to try really hard to not say the word myth very often, but if I do, if I slip up and if I say it on accident, first off, I'm sorry. I'm trying to get better about that, but sometimes I just can't help myself. But if I do, I want you to come back to this point in your notes and go, oh, he's not saying this means it's not true. Myth is a kind of genre of literature. But here's the other thing about that. I hope you can see my board behind me. I won't know that until I edit this, so I'm sorry if you can't. But the point is that for us, we tend to view myths as kind of taking place inside the bubble of creation, right? Bigfoot is a myth, I hope not, is a myth that exists here inside our sphere of influence or our sphere of understanding. But for the Jewish people 3,000, 4,000 years ago, myths were how they described their understanding of all the world. You see, myths were world-shaping stories. The world did not shape their myths. Their myths shaped their understanding of the world. And here's why that matters. Whether it's historical or not, I don't think that matters. Now, that may sound harsh to you. That may sound shocking to you. But I don't think it matters a lot to our understanding of God if Genesis chapters 1 through 11 actually happened historically. I don't care if they did, but I also don't care if they don't, because what they are is they are the preservation of the way that the Israelite people understood God in their time. And what's so important about that is the Holy Spirit came along and said, this understanding of God is correct. And the Holy Spirit made sure those understandings of God got into our Bible. They were so foundational. Genesis 1 to 11 is basically, I think, the mythology of the Israelite people. Again, that doesn't mean it's not true. It means that it shaped the way they understood all of the world. These were not just stories of how the world came into being. These were not just stories of a guy in a boat. These are not just stories of the first murder. These are not just stories of a big tower. These are stories that shaped the universe to these people. And that's what I want us to understand about these stories today. Because the important thing to me is that God looks at their understanding and says, you've got it right. And he put it in the Bible. Okay? So, with all that said, let's jump in to Genesis chapters 1 to 11. Now, I know that you already talked about Genesis 1 and part of 2 last week, so I'm going to kind of skip over a lot of the details of those because Greg did such a wonderful job talking about those. But I want to talk about them briefly because Genesis chapters 1 through 11 are basically part of one collection that we call the primeval history. We'll get there in a moment. Now, I know that there are multiple ideas of where these stories come from. And I know that for a lot of us, we grow up thinking, hearing, and believing that Moses wrote all of these down. There's some, there's tradition in the rabbinic tradition that tells us that Moses did that. Some of that comes from a passage of Deuteronomy. You'll see that later, where it says that God told Moses to write down all the law, and he did. And what happened was the scribes, when they get to 400, 300 BCE, they say, well, they're talking about all 5 books of the Torah, because all 5 books of the Pentateuch were the Torah, were the law. And so they said, no, Moses wrote all of these. I will confess to you, it is my opinion that Moses did not write all of them. But I'm going to say again, I don't think that matters a lot. We're going to talk a little bit about why I think it matters a little bit, but I don't think it matters a lot. It is my belief, it is my understanding that the first 5 books of the Bible, some of them were written long ago, and some of them were written down later, and all of these 5 books were kind of compiled together by scribes and teachers of the law while they were in exile in Babylon. You see, what was happening was they were taken to Babylon in 580 something, depending on where they were in the area. They were taken into Babylon in 580 something, and they were beginning to feel oppressed by the Babylonian religion. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But what they begin to do is they begin to make sure that they know exactly what it is they believe. What are the stories of our people? What are the stories of our fathers? What are the stories of our ancestors? What are the things that we have believed for generations of people? And we should write those things down. Now again, this doesn't mean that these stories don't come from the time of Moses, but we're pretty sure they were written down late. And we have good reason for that, but I'm not going to get into all the reasons because this is not an archaeology class. This is a class about the Torah. But again, that's my understanding, and here's why I say that. A lot of the stories in Genesis chapters 1 through 11, especially these first 11 books of the Bible, or first 11 chapters of the Bible, sorry. A lot of the material that's in here is very Babylonian feeling. I'm going to show you a little bit later on that there's a lot of times where it feels like the Israelites are kind of in contest with the Babylonians as far as religion goes. Now, it's also worth pointing out that I may be wrong. I'm going to say it again. I may be wrong, but here's what I think matters. I think that because we have other stories from the Babylonian era, right? Because we have other stories like Enuma Elish and the Epic of Gilgamesh that we'll talk about, I think that it's more likely that the Israelites made sure to write their things down while they were around those other stories than it is that they wrote them down beforehand. And part of the reason for that is that we have very, very, very old versions of some of these Babylonian stories. Some of them so far back they're written in cuneiform, okay, before regular alphabets. But we don't have that for some of these biblical stories. But what I think happened is that in the midst of religious turmoil, the Jewish people wrote their stories down as an anti-narrative. They wrote it down as a story of why the other religions were wrong and why Yahweh did things differently. So we'll see that in a little bit. But to give you a little illustration of what I think is going on here, you may remember the story from your early American history classes that the Puritans, they were struggling with their religious ideals in England. They felt oppressed, and so they decided that they are going to go somewhere else. Do you remember where they go first? They go to Holland. They go to the Netherlands first. That's not far away, right? You don't have to sail a whole ocean to get there. It takes only a couple days to get there instead of a couple weeks. So they go to Holland first because there's lots of religious freedom in Holland. And they're really excited about living in Holland and living out their Puritan ideals. But what happens not long after they're there is that they realize that their children are forgetting their English heritage. They're becoming Dutch. And they don't like that. So what do? They board another ship and they sail across the ocean. So that is an example, a more recent, more modern example of a group of people who don't like the influence from the people around them, and so they set up their own community to do something different while they are in exile. That's similar, not exactly the same, but similar to what I think the Israelites are doing. Now, I want to talk briefly, there's one word I've used before, it's called the primeval history. The primeval history is the technical academic term for the first 11 books of the Bible. Primeval is a Latin word that comes from primus, meaning first, and avum, meaning age. So in Latin, those two words come together and we get what the primeval history means is it means the history of the earliest ages. So that is the term given to the first 11 chapters of Genesis, because these first 11 chapters seem to be dealing with a different kind of thing than the rest of the book of Genesis, right? Genesis chapters 12 through 50 are all about the patriarchs, about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph, and you're gonna read about all those stories and talk about them. But the first 11 chapters are very different in their genre than what is following. So they have a different name. So I want to back up to Genesis chapter 1 just a little bit and say just a couple things about creation, okay? Because I don't like talking about the creation story as only relating to Genesis chapters 1 through 2 for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, classical Christian theology asserts that God is a creative God and that God is always creating. That's a mind-blowing thing to think about, but that is what classical Christian theology teaches us about God, that God does not stop creating. God is creative. Creation is something that God does. And so what that should tell us is that Genesis chapters 1 and 2 are not the totality of creation, but they tell us about God's creative nature. The second reason that I don't like only talking about 1 and 2 as creation is that it is my belief that all of Genesis chapters 1 through 11 are about acts of creation. That is that Genesis chapters 1 through 11 are the way the Israelites understood how the world came to be. And we'll see that doesn't just mean the physical earth and trees and animals, but even the creation of culture and the creation of differences. There are some other reasons that I want to talk briefly about creation and going all the way back to our myth idea. In the Israelites' world, there are two pretty famous creation myths. You may have heard of them. One of them is what's called the Baal epic. That is about the god you think it is, the god Baal, who the Israelites are dealing with from, basically Judges all the way through 2 Kings into the time of their exile. So, again, I think that Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are being written down, compiled, put together. And when I say written down, I really mean copied, I guess. Their final edition is being done in the exile. They're familiar with the Baal stories. In the Baal epic, the Canaanite god Baal, he kills a god called Yam, who is the god of the sea. And then he uses Yam's body, however a sea has, whatever a body of a sea is, Baal uses that to create the world. The Babylonians have another story. Theirs is called Enuma Elish. In their story, there's a conflict among the gods, and the gods divide into two sides. The upstart, young gods, there are young deities and there are old deities. That's how they're split, young and old. Look at that. Generational differences are as old as humanity itself, apparently. But the young gods and the old gods begin to fight. So they select champions for either side. The young gods pick the god Marduk. The older gods select one of the oldest gods in the Babylonian understanding of the world. They pick the goddess Tiamat, a primordial being, who, by the way, is also the god of the sea and of sea monsters. There's a war that breaks out. Tiamat's husband is killed, and then she is killed by Marduk. Marduk uses Tiamat's body to create the heavens and the earth, and after her husband had died, she had made a new consort. Marduk kills him too, and he uses the new consort's blood to create humanity. Now, as this story ends, the gods build a temple for Marduk called a Sagia. And at that temple, which we have the archaeological ruins of, we know where it was. At Asagia every year on New Year's Day, they would read the entire epic of Enuma Elish out loud as a ceremonial victory of Marduk slaying Tiamat. Every year it was read aloud. And here's why that's important. Because the Israelites who are in exile, they're there for maybe 50 years in Babylon. So 50 times, at minimum, they hear the story of Marduk slaying Tiamat and using her body and her lover's body to create the world. Now, what's interesting is that in the biblical creation story, in the biblical creation account, we are told that God hovers over the what? The waters. And the Hebrew word for waters is the word tehom. This word tehom is etymologically, that means it's the history of the word is related to the word for Tiamat. The Akkadian word for Tiamat is Tiamtum. They are related. They are effectively the same word. One of them is in Hebrew, one of them is in Akkadian. Akkadian's older than Hebrew, but that doesn't really matter except to say that they are related. And so what's fascinating about that is that in the Christian creation story, we still have a God who hovers over, whose spirit is on top of Tiamat, the goddess of the sea. And what does God do? God reaches into her body, effectively, and creates out of it, right? God speaks into the formless void, into Tiamat. So this is what I want you to hear. That this is part of why I think that this story, at least in its final version, is late in its writing. Because there are direct connections between the Enuma Elish creation story and the biblical creation story. They are talking about the same thing, about how one God created the world. We're going to talk about some differences here in a moment. When it comes to creation, we then start talking about, right, let us make them in our image. The word for image, I've given it to you in your handout, is the Hebrew word damuth. This is the Hebrew of it. This is a word that has become a very important word for us in our Christian theology, because what does it mean for us to be made in the image of God? This becomes a vital understanding of what Jesus is doing later. Too often, I think, we hear people talk about the specific way in which we are images of God. Well, it's our cognitive capabilities, as if there's some difference between us and other animals only in our brain. But the way that we are educating, chimpanzees and gorillas to learn to communicate tells us that maybe it's not just our cognitive nature that's different. Later on, theologians would talk about us having a soul, and that's what it means. But God doesn't have a soul, so that can't really be it, can it? The interesting thing is that originally, back in the 1000 BC, there was a statue that we have in the Babylonian area, statue of this king. And at the bottom of that statue, there's a little engraving that says, "This is a carving of the king whatever his name was. And that word, this is a statue of the king. Statue is this demoth word. Demuth seems to be the word, what the Israelites understood is that God looked like us. That's what that seems to have meant. Why do we look different than the animal kingdom? Right? That's a question that they're asking. Why do we look different? Well, we must be made in the images of God. And what I love about this is that I don't think the earliest Israelites who wrote this down, I don't think they fully understood what that meant. But God knew that that was going to become an important image for us to have. So he let them write it down and he let it be preserved, because for 2,000 years later, Christian theologians are going to say, well, this is maybe what that means. We're images of God. We're supposed to be the representatives of God into the world, and we messed it up. Now, real quick, before we leave creation and start talking about sin, I want to mention that there is other creation stories in the Bible. Maybe that surprises you. It surprised me the first time I found it out. We have other places in the Bible. I've got them in your notes. Isaiah 27, Isaiah 51, and Psalm 74. All three of these passages talk about the Lord, Yahweh, punishing or destroying or fighting some sort of sea monster. Okay, so when in Isaiah 51, as an example, when you find the word Rahab there, that is not talking about the prostitute Rahab from the Joshua story. That's not who that's talking about. Rahab is an old Hebrew and an Ugaritic, which is another language from back in that time. It's a name for this kind of cosmic sea monster. Right? Maybe you're familiar with the Norse creation story and the fact that the Norse mythology, again, the way that the Norse understood the world was that there was this giant serpent around the middle of the world. That's kind of what the Rahab was in the ancient Near East. And in Isaiah 51, they have this story about God cutting it up, piercing the dragon in the days of old. These are allusions. These are metaphors of the creation of the world, especially in Isaiah. We know Isaiah is prophesying around the time of the Babylonian captivity, a little bit before, but around that time he's familiar with these Babylonian and other Canaanite stories. And so what does he do? He uses those stories to make a point about God. He says, no, it wasn't Baal who cut the Rahab. It wasn't Marduk who killed Tiamat. It was Yahweh who spoke into the Tehom, who spoke into the Rahab, who crushed the Leviathan. So I point those scriptures out just to say that I think that what we have in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 is in some way a more drawn out version of these allusions that we have in Isaiah and in Psalm 74. So, what these tell me, they maybe tell you, maybe you think I'm wrong. That's okay. But what they tell me is that the Babylonian and Canaanite creation stories were known. They were known around the people. And so what they did, what the Israelites did, is they took some of those stories and they changed them to be about Yahweh. They changed them to say, no, you've got the wrong God. You've misunderstood the story. And what's important for us is that God gave them to us. Okay? Again, it is my conviction that God guided the church as they figured out what parts of the Old Testament and New Testament should be part of the Bible. Because there were books and there were parts of books that didn't make it. Okay? There are parts that didn't make it, but these did. And so that should tell us that they are important. And so what's important to me, or where my interest lies, is in comparing these Jewish stories to their Babylonian and Canaanite counterparts and looking for where they diverge. Because where they diverge tells us something incredibly important about God. And that brings us to the most important point of divergence that I have seen in my time. Now, I only have a master's degree. I don't have lots of study. I've not read every story in the world, but I have read and I am familiar with a fair bit of the creation stories of different cultures throughout the world. And I can tell you that the only creation story that I have read, maybe you know of one that I don't, but the only one that I have read where humanity is the one who messes up the relationship between God and humanity, the only story that says it's our fault is the Jewish story. You see, in Babylon, in the areas around the Israelites, the gods just put up with humanity. They don't like humans. They're kind of a sad after effect, or in some stories, they're made to be servants of the gods. But that's not exactly what we see in the Bible, is it? In Babylon, in their flood myth, their story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, in that story, the reason the flood happens is because humanity is noisy. That's it. They make too much noise. Now, I'm a loud person, but I would hate it if my loud voice is what led to the flood. But in our book, in our story, in Genesis, the problem with the world is it's not the capriciousness of God. It's not that we're just annoying, though we are, let's be real. It's not the capriciousness of God. It's the failure of humanity, right? The problem in our book is that Adam and Eve listen to a serpent. They eat from a tree that they're not supposed to eat from. According to the Super Bowl commercials, apparently it was an avocado tree. I don't think so, but I'm in. Sure, avocado tree. But the problem with humanity is that we do what's right in our own eyes instead of trusting God. In our story, God creates humanity as an act of grace. God creates humanity because God wants to create humanity. God creates humanity and loves them. God creates humanity and says they were good. Not noisy, not annoying. They were good. So, the difference to me, the important thing to me, as we compare these stories, especially when we talk about Adam and Eve, is to look at the difference. Is to look at it and go, well, what does this tell us? Where is the thing that we need to take away from this? I say that because you all are going to serve in the church in some form or another. You're going to have to field questions from adults, from parents, from teens, from young people, like DNA is telling us maybe Adam and Eve aren't what we thought they were. Maybe in some time in the future, they'll have some other question about the quote, historicity of Adam and Eve. Now, I told you, I don't care about that. Because I find value in the Adam and Eve story, whether or not it's historical. Whether or not two people who maybe didn't have belly buttons, right? That's the question. Whether or not that actually happened doesn't change anything for me. Now, I would love it if it did. It's a cool story. My name is Adam. Cool, right? I mean, that'd be awesome. But here's why I say this. Here's my encouragement. So if I lost you for a sec, come back with me real quick, okay? You're going to have people for whom this is a really big question. They're going to go off to college and they're going to have some atheist friend who says, how do you believe in that? That obviously didn't happen for these reasons. And we can disagree with those reasons. That's fine. But I have found in my own ministry that the most important thing I can do, the most helpful thing I can do is say, you know what value I find there is that it talks about sin. It describes a reality in the human condition, and it describes a reality in the relationship with God that I don't see any other story addressing. And it's in that moment where we go, let's talk about that. I'm not trying to side skirt the question. I'm trying to show what I think is the value in this story. The value in this story is that the Israelites, the Jewish people, the exiles, they understood that the problem was us. We're the problem. and that God loves us anyway. Now, I have to say that we're not going to solve the original sin question. I could have started 2 hours ago and ended 2 months from now with a video talking about original sin. Did the sin of Adam pass into their children through some sort of, is it in their blood? Is it in their nature? What does that mean? We don't have time to talk about that, but here's what I am going to say about the topic of original sin, or the idea of Adam's sin and its influence on the rest of creation and humanity. This idea is super important to Paul. Super important to Paul in the book of Romans. Paul writes in the book of Romans, chapter 5, "Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death came through sin, and death spread to everyone because all have sinned, sin was indeed in the world before the law, but sin is not reckoned when there is no law. But death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who did not sin in the likeness of Adam, who is a pattern of the one who was to come." Now, Paul will eventually move from there to talk about how just as one man's sin led to death for everyone, so too will one man's righteousness, Jesus, lead to life for everyone. We'll talk about that here in a second. But I bring that up to point out that we cannot fully understand the way in which Adam's sin impacted the world. And there are lots of theories about that, but that is all they will ever be, is theories, until the day that we stand before God and He unravels the mystery of our faith to us. That is a mystery that we can try to understand, that we can come up with ways to understand, that will help us talk to other people and help us lead other people to faith. But unfortunately, they will only ever be theories. What is interesting to those of us who read this text clearly is that God says they'll die, and they don't. And we go, well, wait a minute. What the heck? God, are you lying to these people? Are you lying to them from the start? Like, what? What? Well, what do we do with that? Now, of course, the fact that they are banished from the garden, right, tells us that they are, in fact, there is a sort of death that they experience. Now, again, I choose to read this as a kind of metaphorical death. They obviously didn't die. In fact, they lived for like hundreds of years afterwards. But there is a death of sorts in this moment. That death may be, oftentimes you'll hear people talk about this death being like if they had stayed in the garden forever, they would have lived forever. And to that point, that is the image that the book of Revelation plays upon. There's a reason that in Revelation we go back to the garden of the tree of life, because in that garden we find life forever. So sure, maybe that's one way to understand that if they had lived in that garden forever, they would have lived forever, but God kicks them out, so they have to die eventually. I think that what happens, though, is the death of their relationship with God. There is some sort of fracture in that relationship that is never the same again. All of humanity, right? It's just two people, but that's all of it at the time. All of humanity can walk in a step with God, right? All of them. Ostensibly, if nobody had sinned, we could have all walked day by day by day with God. And yet, sin happens. Paul tells us that even though we all don't sin like Adam, we all do sin. So we've all messed up, and none of us get to walk with God perfectly. There's a death in that relationship. To quote, I read this, and it always makes me think of that quote from Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars Return of the Jedi, where he says, he's talking to Luke Skywalker about how Luke's father died, but he didn't actually die. And he says, your father was seduced by the dark side, and at that time, the person who I knew as Anakin Skywalker had been killed by Darth Vader. Then he says, so what I told you was true from a certain point of view. And what I think the whole Bible teaches us is that in order to understand it, we have to have the correct point of view. The bummer is that sometimes the point of view is this way, and sometimes it's that way, and sometimes it's a different point of view. And we have to ask God to show us that point of view. Now, when we're talking about the garden, I want to point out a couple things. That Christian tradition, right, our religious upbringing, 2,000 years of Christianity, 2,000 years of theology, they have taught us that the snake is Satan and that Genesis 3:15 is a prophecy for Jesus' coming. Now look, I'm not going to say that it's not that, but I am going to point this out. Never once in the book of Genesis is the word Satan used. Never once. It's just a serpent. Now, serpents were metaphors in all sorts of stories from that time. Serpents were often evil creatures. So it makes sense for us to associate that with Satan, right? In our theology, Satan is the one who makes us sin. But it doesn't say that in the text. Never once is the serpent said to be evil. He's just cunning, and he asks a question and leads them astray. Never once are we told that God is talking in Genesis 3 about anything other than normal human experience. These are people who live in the desert, and they are constantly being battled by snakes. In fact, later on in the book of Numbers, you will read a story where fiery serpents kill a bunch of Israelites. Yikes. This is a constant understanding for them, that humanity and serpents are at odds. Now, I'm not telling you that you can't believe this is Satan. You very well can. In my preaching, I would preach this as Satan, but I need us to understand as scholars of the Bible, because you are a scholar of the Bible, I need you to understand that that is an interpretation. It is not in the text. Nevertheless, what I want to point out in this passage in the garden is that I find in the garden the distinguishing feature of our faith. I find the garden to be the distinguishing feature of our story, of the story that God is telling. Without the garden, I don't think the story makes sense. It's that important. The story of the garden is critical because it tells that there is a problem in the world, but that it is our fault. It is not God who messed the world up, it is us. It is not God who just gets capricious or will, on a whim, that's the word I was trying to think of, just decides to do things. It's our problem, and we'll see that throughout. The problem is that we want to be like God, that we are prideful and arrogant, and that we want to be like God, and we don't really care what the consequences might be. Now, the ironic thing here is that ultimately the work that God is going to do throughout Jesus and through the Holy Spirit in our lives is that God is going to make us like God. God is going to make us like Jesus. Jesus is God. In fact, in Psalm 82, which is then quoted in John 10, there's this idea, you are like the gods, and yet you will die, is that psalm passage. But Jesus kind of flips that on his head, and Christian tradition does the same. We move quickly to Cain and Abel, this kind of odd story. What do we do with this story? It feels a bit weird, right? Like we have these two brothers who kind of show up out of nowhere, first off. And whatever we want to think about original sin, about sin just kind of creeping into the next generation with, whatever we want to think about original sin, the story of Cain and Abel tells us that there is little that we can do of our own condition. Our condition is messed up, and we can't do anything about it on our own. This story does remind us that sometimes God's going to do things that we do not understand. We are not told why God liked one offering over the other, and anybody who tells you they know why the text goes that way, they're arrogant and full of themselves. The text does not say. Why? Why does God like one over the other? We don't like to say it, but it feels like God's being arbitrary here. God is love, we're told. God delights in us. God calls us beloved. But what do we do when it seems like what we do best, God doesn't like? That's what Abel Or that's what Cain has to deal with. That God likes Abel's sacrifice and he doesn't like Cain's. And Cain takes that personally. Cain takes it personally and he kills his brother. Cain, if nothing else, Cain shows us what not to do. Cain shows us how not to respond to God being mysterious to us. Cain shows us what the result of our sin is. It's that we take things to the wrong place. It shows us the result for sin. It's death. Right? That's Paul. The wages of sin is death. Death enters the world because of sin. God told, if we go back to that Genesis 3 where God proclaims the curse upon Adam and Eve, he says that there will be enmity between the offspring. There will be strife, there will be struggle between the offspring. And what do we find? Exactly that. Now, ultimately, right, these people, they fight, one of them kills the other. And Adam and Eve have to deal with the unconscionable result of their own sin. Their child killed another child of theirs. What do we do with that? I don't know what we do with that, except to say, I think this is a result. This shows us that Cain and Abel, they hadn't eaten from the tree. They hadn't done that. And yet something was still wrong in the world. This does lead us to a question, doesn't it? Right? God puts this curse on Cain somehow, some mark. God puts a curse on Cain and sends him away. And what does Cain say? What does Cain do? I meant to grab my Bible. Cain responds to God's curse. You see, God says, "Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you, and you will be a restless wanderer in the earth." God says, look, unfortunately, you're going to wander. You cannot live here anymore. You're going to wander away restlessly. You will not be able to sleep, he says. And Cain freaks out. He says, God, my punishment is too great. He basically says, kill me now. He says, because if I go away, somebody's going to find me. They're going to kill me because they've heard that I'm a murderer. They're not going to let me live with them. Now, we might ask the question, who is Cain afraid of? Good question. Text doesn't tell us. This is, again, why some scholars think that these stories are kind of a combination of other stories. Right? Adam and Eve haven't even had their next child yet, who goes on to become the main child that all the rest of the population comes from. They haven't had that child yet, so who is Cain afraid of? Is he afraid of some future people group? Are there other people that have been created that we're not told about? Unfortunately, we just don't know, but we do know that he is afraid of people. He's afraid of how he will be received. And I want to point something out in this story that, again, I think is critical because it shows us the nature of God. What does God do? God then gives him another thing. He gives him some sort of sign. He marks his body in some way, we're told. And that God then says that whoever sees that sign will know that they cannot kill you, and if they do, I will judge them more harshly than I've judged you, right? He says, look, I will protect you. I will put something on you that protects you so that other people know what it is, which is kind of this weird thing, like how will these other people that we don't know who they are, how will they know what this sign means? We aren't supposed to ask. That's a question that we aren't even really supposed to ask, I don't think. But what I see God doing in Cain's life is showing him grace. He says, you're right. You will be killed for what you did. And by the way, you deserve to be killed. But I'm not going to let it happen. I'm not going to let it happen. I think that part of what we see here in the Cain and Abel story is that we see God protecting Cain with community. He says, I know community is important. I know that you need other people around you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to protect you in the midst of your community. I'm going to protect you wherever you go so that you can find community, because I do know that community is important. I know that. Because let's remember, ultimately, what God is going to do is he's going to create a people group. He's going to create a community. And then again, he's going to create a new community in the New Testament. God is about community. And why? Because we Christians think that God is triune. He is in community at all times. So in Cain's story, we find God's grace. After Cain and Abel, we get these kind of, we get this genealogy, and we move on, and basically it's a way for the author, for the Bible to kind of quickly move us to the next major event that happens, the flood. See, what we find from Cain and then, of course, Seth to the time of Noah is that people don't get better. We don't get better over time. We're not like wine. We don't age well. As things go on, in fact, it seems we get worse, don't we? As things go on, we find that God gets frustrated because there is all this wickedness in the world. Now, of course, this starts with kind of a weird text in chapter 6, where we're told that humanity began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them. And they were told that the sons of the god saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them that they chose. And then we get this story that the sons of the gods and the daughters of man, they kind of have these weird babies called the Nephilim, and these sons of gods and the daughters of men, they teach each other things they're not supposed to know, and that creates all this wickedness. And that leads us to some really weird questions, or some really weird thoughts, like, sons of gods, who, what? Now, your translation perhaps says son of God, sons of God. We aren't sure how to translate this passage. You see, in Hebrew, the word for God, there are two words. We have the word Elohim and the word El, okay? Elohim is the plural. This word actually means gods. El means God. The problem is that the Old Testament uses these words interchangeably. It seems that by the time the Bible's being written down, they use Elohim to mean singular God, or sometimes gods. And so we aren't really sure what this is talking about. This leads to all sorts of theories about who these people are and how we should interpret them. There are a couple different, our book that we've read for this class mentions a couple ideas. I'll run through them really quickly. The first theory is that they are the sons of Seth. There is a man whom I very much think everybody should read. His name is Ephraim the Syrian. He's a Christian church father from the desert, basically. But he wrote poems on paradise. I've quoted this in your notes. He talks about the being cast out of paradise. And we have this kind of two-stanza poem here where Adam sinned, God cast him out from paradise. You see, for the way that Ephraim the Syrian understood paradise is that paradise sat on top of a mountain. Perhaps that reminds you of Mount Olympus. Well, Ephraim comes after the Greeks, so he understands that the mountain of God once had paradise sitting on top of it. And his idea is that when God casts Adam and Eve out of the garden up here, they get to live like down here. Right, just a little bit lower. Not quite in paradise, but not at the very bottom yet. Okay? And then he says, so the sons of Seth, they live up here. But what happened is that the sons of Cain, they were told they were going to wander. So Cain's family all lives down here. They're humanity. Those are the sons of man. And so in Ephraim the Syrian's interpretation of this story, the sons of the gods are sons of Seth who come down and have babies with the daughters of Cain. Now what's funny is that he still thinks that these sons of Seth have like almost like Greek mythological hero bodies. That they live so close to paradise that their food is like enriched with God power. And so they are bigger and they're stronger and they're smarter and all these things. And so that's why they have babies with these women that are bigger than normal. That's one theory. There's another, there's a book called the Book of Enoch that we have copies of. The Book of Enoch is a fascinating book because we know that it's written in like 300 BC. Maybe even later than that. It may be being written about the time Jesus is born, right? I mean, it may be that new. What's fascinating about it, though, is that it is quoted in two different books of the Bible. I believe it's 2 Peter and in the book of Jude, they quote the Book of Enoch, even though the Book of Enoch is not in our Bible. Part of the reason for that is that we know Enoch didn't write it, because we know basically when this was written, and it's like, if Enoch lived in 2000 BC or something like that, probably further back, we know we're told he didn't die, but we don't think he came back to earth, wrote a book, and then went back to heaven. Anyway, this book, it's named after Enoch, even though he didn't write it. But what's fascinating about the book is that it tells the story of the flood from a couple thousand years after we often think the flood happened. Okay, so in the early centuries BC, they write this story, which is basically, it's a fiction, but it's how they understood that story 200 years before Jesus was born. And in that book, we have a quote, or we have a line where it says, "The Son of Men multiplied in those days. Beautiful and comely daughters were born to them. And the watchers, the sons of heaven, saw them and desired them. And they said to one another, 'Come, let us choose for ourselves wives from the daughters of men, and let us beget children for ourselves.'" Now, as you read that story, if you read it, it's very fascinating. What you find out is that these sons of heaven, these watchers, are basically angels. They are fallen angels, or this is effectively how the angels fall. They're in heaven. They look down at earth and they go, "Man, those women look beautiful. Let's go have babies." So they go down, they impregnate these women. They have these babies who are like 300 feet tall. That's why if you've seen Darren Aronofsky's movie Noah, and you might have been like, "Man, where are these weird transformer things coming from?" That is, he is actually using the Book of Enoch as his inspiration for that movie. Okay? That's where he comes from. And what's fascinating then is that you have these like archangels who come in and they like fight off the sons of these angels. It's weird. Anyway, another tradition of who these things are is that some people think that this flood story is really, really, really old, and it comes from a time when Israel was polytheistic. Now, that shouldn't surprise you. We know Israel struggled with polytheism all throughout the book of Judges, and then again through 2 Kings. They're constantly waging this battle between the Baals and Asherah and Molech and Chemosh and all. I mean, they're dealing with these other gods. And so one theory is that this story comes from the time period when Israel believed in multiple gods. And so they had sons of these gods who came and they then had babies with these women. Now, you might be going, "Adam, why does this matter?" Here's why it matters, I think. Because part of what this story ends up being about is about how there's one God, and how one God doesn't like what humanity's doing, and so that one God makes a decision to try and fix it that doesn't work, right? God tries to solve the problem of sin by finding the best person he can, Noah, put him in an ark, saying, "Hey, I'm going to kill everybody else, but your family, because y'all are cool. You pass the vibe check. Keep all the animals safe except for the dinosaurs, and we're going to protect you. And we're going to try this again." But what we find out not long after, is that it doesn't work, does it? And so God says, hey, I'm not going to do it again, and that's it. Now, I'm going to run, I have a bunch of notes on this, and I'm not going to use them all, but because I want to be, I want to be a little quicker for you. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a Babylonian story it's kind of this weird thing where in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is about these two friends, inside this story, they are told a flood story that is just absolutely similar to the biblical flood story. We have stone tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh dating all the way back to 2100 BCE, which means that the story is even older than that, right? Because if we have written versions, that means the story has to be at least 1 year older, and it means that it's probably far older than that. But in this story, we have two guys. We have Gilgamesh and Enkidu. Gilgamesh was part god. He was a child of the gods. Let's keep that in mind. But he was mean, and the other gods created a man named Enkidu to be his rival. He lived among the animals in peace, but was rejected by the animals when he had sex with a temple prostitute. That's how the story goes. Even back there, they were writing erotica. Who knew? Anyway, later on in the story, they meet a man named Utnapishtim. They have cool names back then, don't they? This Utnapishtim man tells Gilgamesh the story of the flood, and it's important here because Utnapishtim, he has been granted immortality, and Gilgamesh is seeking immortality, and he wants to know how to live through throughout the world. And so we hear this story about how the gods decided to destroy humanity through a flood, and they tell this man to create a giant boat, and he does, and then afterwards Utnapishtim is rewarded with eternal life. Men would die, but humanity would continue. Now, some of the details are fascinating here. Now, they're different in a couple places. Like in the Gilgamesh story, the flood only lasts 6 days, right? Whereas in the Bible, it lasts a lot longer than 6 days. On the seventh day, this is where it gets interesting. On the seventh day, he released a dove that flew away but came back to him. So he released a swallow, but it also came back to him. Then he released a raven that was able to eat and scratch and did not circle back to the boat. At that point, he decides to get off the boat. So the boat lands on top of a mountain, similar to the one that we're familiar with, and Utnapishtim offers a sacrifice. He sacrifices sheep and offered incense at a ziggurat, at a pyramid, where he placed 14 vessels into the fire. The gods smelled the sweet odor of the animal and gathered like flies over the sacrifice, which should remind us that in Genesis 6, God is said to like the aroma of the sacrifice. When the great goddess arrives, she lifted up her beads around her neck. She has like a pearl necklace. And she says, as surely as I shall not forget this lapis lazuli, it's a kind of gem, around my neck, I shall be mindful of these days and never forget them. The gods may come to sacrifice to the sacrificial offering, but Enlil may not come because he brought about the flood and annihilated my people without considering the consequences. Now, I tell you that to say that we find these parallels to these other stories, right? Where the question is, which story came from the other story? And I don't really care a ton about that. I have my opinion. Maybe you can guess it, but I don't think it matters a ton. What matters to me is the differences between them and why our story is the one the Bible preserves instead of the other one. Because our story tells something different about God. Our story tells us about a God who only destroys humanity because we're evil. Okay. And he destroys humanity and then realizes it didn't work. So he puts up a rainbow in the sky to remind himself, not the beads around his neck. So I just want to talk about how I think these stories are in conversation with each other. We can imagine two people sitting around a campfire, and each one says, let me tell you the story of the flood. And one of them tells the Epic of Gilgamesh, and one of them tells the biblical flood. And then they would say, how does this teach us about God? Which one seems more true to life? Why did the Jews write this story down? Why did it survive? They're living in a place telling a story about the supreme gods who just are, they have great antipathy towards humanity. They don't like them. They want to destroy them just because. Who cares? The Jews take that story and change it. Or they at least tell a different story. They say, no, it's not about Ea, it's not about Enlil, it's not about Tiamat, it's not about those people, it's not about Utnapishtim, it's not about Gilgamesh, it's not about Enkidu, it's about Yahweh and this guy called Noah, and how everybody else in the world was royally messed up. You see, what's different too is that Utnapishtim, he gets eternal life afterwards for kind of like being the one who gets selected, but Noah is selected because he is righteous. In Gilgamesh, the gods destroy humanity because it's noisy. In the Bible, it's because we've sinned. The covenant at the end is different too. In the Babylonian story, the gods basically decide they messed up and they won't do it again, but they don't really care why. In the biblical story, God makes a comment about humanity. He says, the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. Oof, what a claim. What a statement. God says people are the problem, but they are that way from their youth. From the time they're born, they are that way. So it's not. I can't end this by killing them and starting over. Basically, what he says is they're born this way, and this is why the Israelite understanding of the world is different, because they understand God so differently, and they understand humanity differently too. The Jews say, no, God would not do this for a nonsensical reason. Our sin angered God, and it should. Our sin is an affront to God's righteousness. That's why God tried it with the one righteous guy, but God recognized that he wouldn't do it again. And so at the end of that story, we have this kind of weird moment, right? If you've read the story, you know what I'm talking about. Where like all the animals scatter. They've had the sacrifice to God, the rainbow's in the sky, and Noah's like, all right, y'all, I'm getting drunk and going to sleep. Okay, cool. I mean, you've been in a boat for like a year. Did you like make the wine there? That's okay. I'm sidetracked. But the point is that Noah gets drunk. He lies down in his tent and he's naked. Why does that matter? He's in his tent. I don't know why it matters, but the Bible tells us the story. And it says that Ham went in and saw his father naked. And then Ham goes back outside to his brothers and goes, guys, Dad's naked inside. And so then the other brothers that were told, they walk in kind of backwards with a blanket, and they cover their dad up so that his nakedness is covered. But somehow in the morning, Noah knows that Ham has been in and that Ham did something. Scholars for, literally thousands of years, at least 3,000 years, have been trying to figure out what is going on here. All the way back to the rabbinic midrash, we have scholars who are trying to figure out what is going on in this story, and there are all sorts of theories. Did Ham sexually assault his dad? That's a theory. Again, we can't say. There is some question about the language that's being used here with seeing him naked and the way that seeing people naked gets used later on in the law in Leviticus. When you get to those points, maybe you come back here and go, this is how I think it makes sense. One recent idea that I've had is that, one recent idea that I've heard is that there is some, linguistic reason to think that perhaps Ham went in and saw his dad naked and castrated him, which would be wild. I mean, you would certainly know when that happened, I guess. We don't know. But we do know that as a result of this decision that Ham has done, we're told who his descendants are. And we're told that his descendants are basically the people of Canaan that the Israelites come in and kick out later on in the book of, or later on in their story, the book of, Joshua. And yet, there is something important again here about the nature of God, isn't there? Because what are we told about those people who the Israelites eventually kill? What are we told about the people who live in Jericho? What are we told about the people who live, the Amalekites, the Amorites? What are we told about them? We're told that they come from Noah, and we're told that Noah comes from Adam, and we are told that Adam comes from God. You see, the Israelites have this very interesting belief that even their enemies are made from God. Even their enemies are God's beloved children. The genealogy traces them all the way back to God. Now, ultimately, this story is a justification for the conquest that comes later. We have this interesting comment, too, where Japheth's children are said that they are to live in the tents of Shem. Shem is the father of the Israelite people, and Japheth's relatives, which we don't have a whole lot of information on who those people are, we're told that they live in the tents of Shem. It seems to me that God is, again, he's saying, you're getting it right, that there are people who you don't like that I still created. Good for you, you've got it right. And there are people who live in your tents as distant relatives who you don't really know where they come from. That's good. You're going to see when you study Leviticus and Numbers that God is very clear on the way that the Israelites are supposed to be with foreigners. That there are people who can live peacefully with them even though they're not Israelite. We see that here in Japheth. Once again, God is laying the groundwork for hospitality and hostility that will exist for the rest of the Israelite history, just like he did with Cain and Abel. But even in this story, we see God laying groundwork for what is to be expected of his followers with hospitality towards those who are different, towards those who are outsiders. Once again, we kind of we fast forward a bit, and we come to effectively the last story of the primeval history, Genesis chapter 11. The last story of the primeval history, the last story, as I said earlier, of creation. We have this story called the Tower of Babel. We're told that humanity, the whole world had one language and a common tongue. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. I want you to recognize that if we're told that the ark, sorry for my stuttering, we're told that the ark had settled on top of a mountain by Palestine, by the land of Israel, Mount Ararat. Well, that's where the ark was there. It was closer to where they're from. So people head eastward. What is east of Israel? It's Babylon. It's where they're in exile as they're writing this stuff down. What is there? It's the people who they're living with now. So they go east towards Shinar, and they settle down, and they say, hey, let's build a big tower. Let's build a tower so big that we reach the stars. No, not the stars. Let's reach God. And we're left going, what? Seriously? But that's what we're told they thought they could do, that they could build a tower so big that they could reach the gods. Now, it's worth pointing out that is effectively what Babylonian ziggurats were trying to do. Right? The ziggurats, where they buried their rich people, their emperors, their leaders, you bury them in pyramids because that puts them up in the realm of the gods, right? Ephraim the Syrian with his god mountain is not unique in this idea. This is an ancient idea that the higher you could get, the more in the realm of the gods you were. So we build big towers for our dead leaders so that they can be among the gods. So these Israelites, right, they get shipped out of Israel in exile, and they get to this weird this plain over by the Persian Gulf, and they're like, well, wait a minute, like, what are all these towers doing here? You all must have been trying to reach the gods. And then, of course, that's exactly what those ziggurats were for, right? Is to create tombs, to create places of divine, interference or interaction. That's exactly what those ziggurats are for. Now, if you're like me, you grew up hearing the story of the Tower of Babel as all these people thought they were hot stuff, so they build this tower, and God comes down and he's angry, and so he punishes them by confusing their language. Did you hear that story? Is that the way you heard it? Like I said, me too. But I've since come to read this story differently. I read this story differently. Instead of seeing this as simple punishment, I see this story as an act of creation. The final act of creation in the primeval history. What is it that God creates here? I think God creates diversity. God creates ethnicity. God creates cultures. They have one culture right now, we're told. God splits them up and creates multiple cultures. Here's why I think that. Well, first off, let's remember that God has told Noah to be fruitful and multiply. Right? God has repeatedly been like, all right, guys, go multiply. Go scatter yourselves and multiply. But we're told they didn't do that, did they? They gather together and they're moving throughout the plains to Shinar until they find this place that they like. And they settle down and they create this big tower. Well, God goes, that's not what I wanted you to do. That's not what I wanted you to do. I wanted you to go multiply. I wanted you to go live in different places. And by the way, America is a pretty good reminder to anybody who doubts this that you can start in one group or one part of the country, and as you move away and as you move to different parts and as you live in different pockets of the country, differences will naturally occur. Your accent is different than those people who I worked with in New Hampshire. Our accent in New Hampshire was different than those people that I graduated school with in East Tennessee. We're all different, but we all kind of come from the same part of the world, right? Everybody with skin this color, we all come from the same part of the world, and yet there's all this difference. I think God wanted people to go to the different parts of the world, to inhabit it differently. And what we see here in Babel is that God says, if you're not going to do this on your own, I'm going to force you into it. Part of what we see here, I think, is this is how Israel made sense of the differences in the world. Right? They move from a region of the world that speaks Hebrew, and they're yanked into this Akkadian world of Babylon. Before that, they were in the Egyptian world. They're going to come back to Israel, and there's going to be kind of this new language called Aramaic, and Aramaic will eventually be kind of overtaken by a bunch of Greek-speaking people, and those Greek-speaking people will eventually be overtaken by a bunch of Latin-speaking people, and then the world is going to continue to evolve language. The Israelites look around and go, how do we get all these languages? And we have this story of God creating language at Babel. Maybe you doubt my interpretation of this story. I'd encourage you to read the story again. It's only like 9 verses long. Tell me if anywhere in there we're told that God punishes the people with language. We are told that he confuses them, But that's not really punishment, is it? And that's odd to me because every other time where we have some kind of punishment, God says it's for punishment. In Genesis 3, we find, because you ate, I will do these things. Genesis 4, Cain says explicitly that he's being punished. And God shows him grace. In Genesis 6, we are told that God was sorry he had made humanity and resolved to blot out from earth human beings. Right? Those are punishment language. We don't have that here in Genesis 11. And so I think that we've been reading this story incorrectly. Humanity is doing the wrong thing. Don't get me wrong. They are supposed to disperse and populate the earth. They stayed homogeneous and attempted a feat of pride. But God comes down and says, this isn't what I want you to do. Go do this other thing. And to make it so that you have to do it, you now do not understand your brothers and sisters. Go. Figure it out. I think that this is an act of creation, and it tells us that what makes us different is a creation of God. Our brothers and sisters in other countries who speak different languages, those are all signs of God's creative power. You might say, well, why does that matter? You may hear, in fact, you perhaps will hear this year a story, a sermon on Acts chapter 2 with Pentecost. And you may hear a preacher. I will confess that I've probably given this lesson myself. You may hear somebody say, at Pentecost, we find a reversal of Babel. This is God reversing what he did at Babel. This is God changing what he did at Babel. But I don't think that's true. For a couple of reasons. First, I think that God at Pentecost, if it were a reversal of Babel, the people would have spoken one language and everybody would have heard it and understood it, but that's not what we're told. Instead, we're told that everybody heard their own language. And there's like 12 or so different people groups who have a different language who are expressly mentioned in the book of Acts chapter 2. So they don't hear one language, they hear their language, the language that has been given to them by God. The apostles are speaking different languages, and the people hear them. You see, I think that Pentecost is actually God confirming what he already said at Babel. Here's what I mean. What Babel tells me, what Babel shows me, is that the Israelites look at people who are different than them, whether they are the Philistines who are Greeks, whether they are the Babylonians, whether they are the Assyrians, whether they are the Egyptians, whether they are whoever they are who speak a different language than them, the temptation, we know this. I mean, ethnic relations in America are evidence that differences are often hard to deal with. But what the Israelites do is they say these differences come from God. And that is a different narrative than I think most of us tell ourselves. We tell ourselves things like, well, in 50 to 100 years, there won't be different races. There won't be different ethnicities. We'll all be one weird, homogenous, new kind of group. I don't think that's true. And I don't really think it's what God wants either. I think God likes diversity. I think God likes difference. God creates it in Genesis chapter 11. You see, what God is doing at Babel is he's saying, I want you to be different and inhabit different parts of the world. That is part of my plan. And then at Pentecost, what God does is he says, hey, I know I sent you all out different places, but just so you know, this gospel is for you too. Just as my love for you 2,000, however many years ago, was for you, so too now at Pentecost, I am for you. And into the future, those of you at, City Church who are studying this book, he says, you are different people from different backgrounds, and I bless those differences. I think that's what this story is about. I think that's why the Israelites tell it. And I think I hope you see the power in that story. And I think that the power in that story is why God preserved that story for you and for me. So, we have to now take a step out of the details, right? We kind of walked through the 11 chapters kind of on their own. But let's take a step back, and in our final moments together, I want us to kind of try and put some pieces together. Okay? I want us to try and put some pieces back together about the story that God is telling us in these 11 chapters. Because again, I want to remind you, I believe there is a powerful story that is for us and for the world in these 11 chapters. There is a reason that the Spirit has made sure these 11 chapters come to us. There are reasons, probably more than one. I think there are some overarching stories that we can find in these 11 chapters, and they are stories that you will continue to see throughout the rest of your time in this class. The first of those, overarching things. Okay. We might say that these are the answers to the question, what is this story telling us about God and ourselves? That is ultimately what we are after. What is God up to? How do we fit in? Okay? Those are the big questions, right? To do theology, what is God up to? How do I fit in? And for us Christians, where is Jesus? So we're going to talk about those to kind of wrap up today. The first, let's start with ourselves. Ultimately, what these 11 chapters tell us is that left to our own devices, we will royally mess this up. Okay? Left to ourselves, we will mess this up. We will mess up the world. We saw this in Adam and Eve. We saw this in Cain and Abel. We saw this in the story that leads up to the flood. We saw this in the aftermath of the flood. We saw this with the descendants of Ham, Shem, and Japheth. We saw this in the Tower of Babel. And you're going to see it throughout the rest of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That the overarching narrative is that left to ourselves, we will mess it up. Ultimately, this has a really sobering comment about humanity. I've come to realize that I'm not sure I can say that humanity is inherently good. The story of the Bible tells me that's not really true. That a broken image of God is kind of deformed, perverted, inherently bad, inherently flawed. This is why when we get to the church fathers, people like Augustine, Saint Augustine, would talk about what he would call a privation of the good. That evil did not exist in and of itself, but that evil was something good that had been deformed into something bad. A modern example of this would be a cancer cell. Cancer cells are the greatest example for what I think humanity kind of is on its own. Humanity was created and we're called good. A normal cell in your body is good. Unfortunately, something happens along the way, and a normal cell will become unhealthy, and if it becomes too unhealthy, it becomes cancerous, and it begins destroying the cells around it. And those cells destroy, and those cells destroy. I think the same is true of humanity, and that is the story that God is telling us here in Genesis chapters 1 through 11. Now, of course, I can't leave us there, okay? Because Genesis 1 through 11, the primeval history doesn't leave us there. It tells us instead that God does not abandon us, that God refuses to abandon us in our depravity. Okay? Hear me say, the good news of this is that in our depravity, God is looking for a way to save us. While it looks grim, God is intimately involved in our lives, and He is full of grace, and He loves us. We saw this in Adam and Eve, right? God sees them uncomfortable in their nakedness, and He makes them clothes, and He sends them out. He doesn't kill them, does He? He sends them away. In Cain and Abel, God is angry. He has every reason to be frustrated with Cain, and He protects him. Leading up to God could have decided that, you know what, Noah, you've got to have sinned too, right? Our theology is that all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory. So Noah was the most righteous, but he wasn't perfect. And God could have said, you know what, forget it, I'm starting over. But He didn't. He decides He's going to protect a family and try to start over. It doesn't work. And with the Babylonians, God could have come down and gone, you think you're cooler than me? You think you're better than me? Death to all of you, but He doesn't. Instead, He keeps them alive and He sends them out to live the lives that He intended them to live from the start. You see, God is a God of grace. He does not abandon us in our depravity. And I think this is so important. You see, there are, again, I've been talking about them. There are other stories in the ancient Near Eastern world about gods and how they related to humanity. And the stories around the Israelites, the stories that they're trying to engage with at their periphery, all of those stories say that gods kind of tolerate humanity. Humanity was created to serve the gods, but nothing else. And that's why they have to sacrifice, they sacrifice in order to say thank you, or in order to appease the gods. Whereas you'll see that in the Israelite story, we are told in the Bible that they sacrificed as acts of gratitude instead of acts of fear. You see, whereas the other gods say, give me a sacrifice and maybe I'll make it rain. Give me a sacrifice and maybe I'll let your crops grow. Give me a sacrifice and maybe I won't let the storm hurt you. What Yahweh is going to do in His community is the exact opposite. He says, no, I love you and I am going to protect you. What I want you to do is offer sacrifices to me as a way to say thank you. God, you let my garden grow. Here is the first 10% of my garden. God, thank you for the rain that you sent us. Here is a sacrifice as a way to say thank you. And even when it comes to sin offerings, Lord, I am sinful. Thank you for not destroying me. You see, the Israelites are telling a different story. They're telling a better story. They're telling the story of God. Because God is not like the gods of their neighbors. God is a God of love and grace and community and creation. Now, again, I want to address the question that is going to come. If you don't deal with this now yourself, you'll have to deal with this when your children or the students in your youth group or someone that you know asks you this question. Okay? This is an uncomfortable question that we have to deal with, and I'm sorry that we can't do this in person. I'm sorry that we have to address it like this. But I want to remind you again of my conviction. I preach from this Bible. Well, not this exact one, but I preach from the Bible every time I write a sermon. I believe in the words that God has given us in Scripture. I believe that Scripture is useful for teaching, reproach, and exhortation, and all those things that 1 Timothy says. I believe that Scripture is God-breathed. But I also think that the Israelites borrowed a lot of the stories of their neighbors and changed them to be about Yahweh. I know that's a big statement. I know that for some of us that is shocking. I remember the first time I heard that, it was like, wait, what? What does that mean? Here's what I'm going to tell you about how I cope with those questions. We have some Psalms in the Bible. Psalm 29 is a really famous one. You can do some research on that if you'd like. But Psalm 29 is a psalm that we're pretty sure was originally a song about Baal, right? This god that the Israelites are known to worship throughout some of their history. The prophets are constantly saying, no, don't worship Baal, worship Yahweh. No, don't worship Baal, worship Yahweh. No, don't worship Baal, worship Yahweh. This is like the cycle of worship in the Israelite story. But we're pretty sure that Psalm 29 was originally a song that praised Baal. And there are reasons for this around the storm imagery, and it sounds like other stories of Baal from tablets that we have found that are written in a language called Ugaritic. So we're pretty sure that Psalm 29 was originally a song about Baal. And the Jews said, we like that tune, and we like kind of what the general message is about, but we think you've got the wrong deity. We think you've named the wrong God. Instead of it being about Baal, we're going to sing it, but we're going to change the God's name to Baal. And that, that's just what we're pretty sure happened. And yet, Psalm 29 is part of our Bible. Psalm 29 is something that we read in our churches. Psalm 29 may have originally been about a different God, but we read it about our God. Ascribe to the Lord, ascribe to Yahweh, O mighty ones. Ascribe to Yahweh glory and strength. Ascribe to Yahweh the glory due his name. Worship Yahweh in the splendor of his holiness. The voice of Yahweh is over the water. God of glory thunders. Yahweh thunders over the mighty waters. The voice of Yahweh is powerful. The voice of Yahweh is majestic. The voice of Yahweh breaks the cedars. Yahweh breaks in pieces the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon skip like a calf, Syrian like a young wild ox. The voice of Yahweh strikes with flashes of lightning. The voice of the Yahweh shakes the desert. Yahweh shakes the desert of Kadesh. The voice of Yahweh twists the oaks and strips the forests bare. In his temple all cry glory. Yahweh sits enthroned over the flood. Yahweh is enthroned as king forever. Yahweh gives strength to his people. Yahweh blesses his people with peace. We can almost imagine, can't we, how some Baal worshiper had written this song, and they thought they were really hot stuff. And so what happens is we're told that David wrote this psalm. So David says, I like that psalm, but I like it more when we sing it about my God. Because all those things that you're talking about ascribing to Baal, I ascribe to Yahweh because he's better than your God. And so he changes the name. And here's the question that I have to ask you. Do you disagree with any of the things that are in that psalm? Probably not, right? Yes, Yahweh does all those things. But does it matter then? Does it matter? Does it matter if that was originally a Baal song? And they went, no, we like it more this way. We like it more with our God because we think our God's the right one. And we like this story. We like the way it helps us think about things, but we're going to make it about our God. You see, Paul in Romans chapter 1, he makes this comment, he makes this argument that God has revealed God's self to all people. What Paul means is that every single person in the world, whether they know the Bible or not, they should be able to know that God is there. And so what I think has happened is that these other religions, they knew something. They knew that there was a God. They knew that there were things outside their control, and they were trying to understand them. And they wrote down their own religious stories to try and understand those things. And what happens, as you'll see with the story of Abraham, is that Abraham is promised to be a blessing to all people, not just himself, but to all people. And so what if God uses Israel to slowly correct the theology of the people they come in contact with? The really amazing thing about that is that what it means is that perhaps just as God used the confusion of language to create diversity at Babel, perhaps God sent Israel into exile in part as punishment for their sin, but also in part to help them refine their understanding of His love and to challenge the way that other people in the world understood God. Now, I can't prove that theory. I'm just a pastor at a church. But if you ask me, that right there is a powerful story that'll preach that God finds a way in all circumstances to work things out towards the good. I think that's something that Paul said. You know, we could even say that if the Jewish people hadn't adapted some of those myths, if the Jewish people hadn't adapted some of those stories, if the Jewish people hadn't refined some of those people's stories, who knows what would have happened? Because you know what does happen? Down the road, some people from Babylon, they see some stars that look different in the sky and they go to meet a baby. They say, we've come to talk to this king born to the Jews. Because the Jewish people in exile were in conversation with their Babylonian captors. They were at their schools. They were at their temples. They were hearing these stories and they said, you've got it slightly wrong. It's not about Marduk, it's about Yahweh. It's not about Ea, it's about Yahweh. It's not about Utnapishtim, it's about Noah. It's not about this, it's about that. And again, what's amazing to me is that all of these stories, God has said, that's a good story. That's it. That tells people about me. That will lead people to believe in me. Let us remember that ultimately what God is doing in the Bible is asking and inviting us to believe in Him. Okay? I love what St. Augustine said. Again, I'm kind of a sucker for church fathers because they're a lot smarter than I am. But one time, St. Augustine said, all truth is God's truth. And here's what he meant by that. He meant that there is nothing in the world that has happened or that is true that God does not know. You see, what I have discovered, and I'm imagining there will be other lessons that you learn throughout this class that may shock you or surprise you. I mean, there are some rough stories in the Pentateuch that may shock you. I want to remind you that nothing that you learn for the first time is God learning along with you. God already knows. God is there to comfort you. God is there to guide you. God is there to lead you. Okay? Remember that your faith is in Jesus. Your faith is in God, the God that is revealed to us in Scripture. Okay? Your faith is in God. It really has been my honor to be with you, even virtually. I hope that you have come to understand something of these Old Testament passages. I hope that you have come to appreciate the depth that these Old Testament passages hold. I hope that you have come to begin to see the foundations of the story that God is going to tell throughout the Bible. I hope you're still watching with me. I hope you are well. It is my prayer that this class blesses you and your ministry and your understanding further. I can't wait for the next time I get to be with you all, and I hope that you continue to put forth the effort to learn about God, that you might help other people come to fall in love with God.